Sunday morning, we are on the subject of the Passover. Goodness, I got so many things to say. I've given all of you a paper here. It's got a picture of the Big Dipper and the North Star. And I've been teaching on Christmas or Christ Mass or the Yule, and that Christmas is Christ Mass. Christ Mass. And that is the same thing as Yule or wheel in the ancient world. And that was brought into the church by Constantine. It was the old feast of Saturn. That's when they believed the sun was burning out at the winter time. And what I've got here is a picture. The swastika I found out this past week is the Big Dipper and the North Star. That is utterly astounding, isn't it? Now, all that the swastika is, it had many names in the ancient world. It was called the swastika, and swastika means it is good. It was the Swastika Tibetan Buddhist that propagated this more than anyone else, and that is where the Dalai Lama is the head of the Tibetan Buddhist. He had to flee to India in these past years because of insurrection over there. And it's also called Thor's hammer. It was a little different when it was called Thor's hammer. It was longer, like so. Like so. It had the little shorter arms, and you had many variations of it. You had the Iron Cross, or the Maltese Cross is another variation. And it's nothing but a variable of the Tau or Tammuz or the cursed tree, and that's what Jesus was crucified on, was the sign of Tammuz or Tau. And I have been wrestling with where did the fire wheel originate? Well, Elaine McCoy tells us she is a witch, and she tells us that it was the wheel of the year of the ancient world, and that it had a variation to it. Let me show you. It was the wheel of the year, and it had 8 points on it. And Roman Catholicism comes out of this, had 8 points, had the Samhain, which was Halloween, Mabon. This is between summer and fall. This is what it is. It is merely let me say, gosh, there's so much to it. If this were here's the earth. If this right here, this circle was the diameter of the earth at the equator, when you draw a straight line above the earth through the North Pole, a perpendicular to the earth's equator, you go to the North Star or Polaris. And the North Star is called the pole star. That's what Polaris is. The pole star. And it is the brightest star in Ursa Minor. This had everything to do with the pagans in the ancient world. They believed that this Big Dipper is what gave the world all of its food, because all that the swastika is the Big Dipper at 4 different seasons. That's all it is. And they said, here's why they said that they believed that it gave the earth all of its crops. Now remember, God's covenant was that he would bring crops. He gave the land to Abraham in Genesis 17, and then he said in Deuteronomy 28, he said, I'll bring crops. He said, I'll fill up your basket and your store, your womb. But he said, when you're obedient to me, when you're disobedient, I'll empty your womb, your basket, and your store, and I'll bring famine. Well, they believed in the ancient world this is what it was. And this Elaine McCoy shows us among the nature worshipers, because that's what witches are nature worshipers. They're worshipers of the fields and the trees and the crops. It's all about food. And on her picture, she's got 8 points, and there's 8 points on the Roman Catholic Eucharist. And you've got the growing season, the planting, the harvesting, and the fallow. That's why I put it up here. Fallow, growing, from winter. Winter, you go into spring. Spring, everything, you go from the plowing season. They would plow in the winter. Let it lie fallow, and then start plowing and go into the spring, and then into the planting, and then the harvesting. The swastika was good. They considered it good, and they worshipped it in the ancient world. But it was nothing but the Big Dipper in its 4 phases is all that it was. And they said, they called this the wheel of the year, and they said the wheel had to turn in order to go to summer, to fall, to winter, to spring. Well, that is nothing but the rotation of the year going round and round so they could keep having crops. And their great problem was, how can we keep having crops every spring when this devastating winter is coming upon us? So it was the 4 seasons of the Big Dipper. And it had many names and titles. It was called the plow, and some plow having to do with food. It was called the saucepan in French. And all of it was a food thing. Now here's the thing that we need to understand about it. It was called Thor's hammer. It's called the field fought, the gamma cross. It was called the fire wheel. They would actually make it in the form of a wheel and roll it downhill and say that if it got so far, they would have crops in the spring in the Scandinavian world. Well, the fact that it's the dipper going round and round, they thought the earth sat still. That's what they thought, and they thought everything rotated around the earth. So in order to keep having crops, the pagans said, I want you to picture, I need to have somebody make me up a little model of the earth. Directly above the earth is the North Star, and you got the Big Dipper in its various phases. Depending on the season, it's north of the North Star in the summer, it's west of the North Star in the fall, it's just south of the North Star in the winter. It's just the Big Dipper moving is all it is. And since it's the Big Dipper moving, taking them to spring, and that's where they wanted to go so they could have food. They called it the wheel of the year. They called it the nature wheel. So if you can picture the earth and the Big Dipper above it moving in its various phases, they said that was bringing them food. But they thought the earth was standing still, so they said someone had to turn that nature wheel from one season to the other. They did not know the earth was spinning and going in its orbit, and the moon was going in an orbit around the earth, and we were going in an orbit 365 days a year around the sun. They didn't know that. They thought we were sitting still, and someone had to be turning that nature wheel, or wheel of the year. That's what they worshipped as the swastika, the wheel of the year. Isn't that interesting? This is utterly astounding to me. I keep telling you, I never finished studying any subject. And this thing hit me this past week so hard. And it has everything to do with the Bible, because it is God that gives the crops. It's God that gives the food. It is not nature. There's no such thing as Mother Nature. It's God. And witches are nature worshipers. People don't even understand that. They'll tell you that. They are the worshipers of the Big Dipper. So they said something had to be turning that. Well, they said that what turned that wheel of the year was Queen of Heaven. Well, that is the Mary of Roman Catholicism, isn't it? And that's what God condemns Israel for worshiping in Jeremiah, the 44th chapter. And they said, we will not listen to Jeremiah. We will pour out drink offerings to the Queen of Heaven. And Queen of Heaven had many titles in the ancient world. She was called Maria, which is another name for Mary. She was called Melita. And among the Scandinavians, they said that it was Bridget. Bridget, we get the word Britain. And this was the Celtic form. All of them had a different form of it. This was the Celtic form. I'm showing you this. I couldn't wait to show you this, because this is just an addition to some of the things that I've seen about this. And of course, there were 8 points on this. In the winter, they had 8 points on the swastika, and that was because they had 8 different seasons. They were coming out of summer, going into the fall, so they had a point up here, and then they were going out of fall, going into winter, and they had a point here. So, and then they had going from winter into spring, and they had a point here. And each one of these, you had 8 points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 points, which were the different times. And you had Mabon up here, Samhain, which was Halloween, Yule, which was the Christ Mass or the old Feast of Saturn. And then you had Beltane, and then you had Midsummer, and then Imbolg, Ostera, which is Easter, and then back over to Lugnash and Mabon. And all it was the changing of the seasons that they worshiped. They worshiped food, the sun, the stars, so they could have a prosperous year. And she says that they called this Bridget Queen of Heaven. They brought her into the Roman Catholic Church, renamed her Saint Bridget. Did any of y'all ex-Catholics remember her? That's who she was. She's the one that turned the wheel of the year. But here's what's amazing. Remember in Amos, the 5th chapter? Look at this. I had to share this with you, and then I'll get to the message. I just had to share. Here's another form of the wheel of the year. It is stalks of wheat in a circle. This was the Celtic form of it. You get this out of her book, and you can find some of this out of Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrines, and this was Adolf Hitler's mentor, and he was a sun worshiper, a swastika worshiper. And then you can find McClintock and Strong and Hastings and so forth. But let me show you something I've seen. Now, I'm going to have to adjust something I've taught you. It's not in error. It's an adjustment. I've seen something here that's just astounding. I couldn't go without sharing it with you. But when you go over here to Amos, the 5th chapter, and have you noticed how we keep moving into new things on everything we've learned? And you don't ever quit. The swastika is nothing but the Big Dipper and the North Star. It's the Big Dipper in its various phases. It's the wheel of the year. Now they said, you have two schools of thought in the ancient world. You have two schools in the ancient world. The pagans had their school of thought, and they said that it was the Big Dipper in its phases, or the swastika, which gave the food. This was the pagans. Pagans said it was the Big Dipper, and the North Star, which was the swastika. This was the witches and the pagans. They said this is what gave the world its food, because it gave them the seasons when the wheel of the year was turned by the Queen of Heaven. But the rabbis said that it was Pleiades that brought the crops up in the spring and gave the world its crops. So, and gave the world its flowers and what have you. That's what the rabbis said. Well, the Lord said to Job in Job the 38th chapter, can you bind the sweet influences of Pleiades and loose the bands of Orion? And they said that Orion was the evening star, and that brought the sap down in the spring. And God tells Job, I can bind Pleiades where the crops won't come up. The point is not whether Pleiades actually made the crops grow. That's what the rabbis taught. And so God used their culture and their custom to say, here it is. Here's why. Here's what it's about. Here's the culture. Here's the custom. I'll use your way of talking. I can bind Pleiades and stop the apple blossoms from blooming in the spring and stop the crops from coming up. I can loose the bands of Orion and cause that sap to come up in the middle of January, and then I'll hit you with a hard freeze and kill your crops. And I told you, if you don't follow me and worship me, I'll do this to you. I'll dry up your fields, I'll dry up your wombs, I'll dry up your crops. It is not some goddess that's doing this, it's me. It's not some goddess turning this wheel. It is God in charge of the stars. The heavens declare the glory of God, and that's Christ. And all this is Jesus. They thought the earth standing still, and God said, no, this is much more complicated than you think. It's the earth in its orbit. It's the moon in its orbit. It's the sun, even it's in ecliptic path also. Then the pagans said it was the Big Dipper and its phases, or the swastika that was bringing it. Now look here, I've seen something. There were 7 stars in Pleiades. There's 7 stars that make up the Big Dipper. 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, go back to Amos, the 5th chapter. See, all these words are not here for no reason. I'll tell you some other things I'm hunting for. Maybe you can be hunting. Now, this is like something I've been hunting for years, and we've hit upon it. I asked some of you to do some research for me on the internet, and Mary brought me some stuff, and Woody brought me some stuff, and Connie brought me some things, and it's so much to it. Now, look here in the 5th chapter of Amos. For thus saith the Lord unto the house of Israel, verse 4, seek ye me, and ye shall live. But seek not Bethel. They had raised up sun and tree worship in Bethel, which is the same thing as this swastika worship, the fire wheel worship. It's nature worship. Nor enter into Gilgal. That's the first place they came to when they came back to Israel after being in bondage for 400 years. And pass not into Beersheba, and they set up idolatry in Gilgal and in Bethel. He said, do not seek this idol worship of tree and sun worship. For Gilgal shall go into captivity, and Bethel shall come to naught. Seek the Lord, and ye shall live, lest he break out like fire in the house of Joseph, which is northern Israel, and devour it, and there be none to quench it in Bethel. Ye who turn judgment to wormwood or bitterness, and leave off righteousness in the earth. Seek him that maketh the 7 stars and Orion. Now, I used to say that the 7 stars was Pleiades. I don't know that God is not using a dual testimony. Remember, it takes 2 testimonies to hold up in Jewish court of law. I believe what he is saying, it is God that made the Big Dipper in Ursa Minor. He's the one that did that. There's not some goddess turning the wheel, and that's what you're worshiping when you worship the grove, the tree goddess, and when you worship the sun, the fire wheel, or the sun wheel, or the wheel of the year, or the field thought, or the nature wheel, or the wreath. That's where the wreath comes from. He says, seek him that makes the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, which is actually the swastika. God made the swastika. God is the one. He doesn't turn the fire wheel. He turns everything around everything around it and everything around one another. It's not the way they thought. Everything is not. It's kind of like the earth sitting still and we're the center of the universe. Isn't that what we do? We sit still and say, I'm the center of my universe. Everybody look at me. God says, you're not the center, I am. There's no goddess turning this wheel. I made the stars. I have got them rotating in the exact fashion. And I've got the earth rotating and turning and going around the sun and going in a path. And I'm the one that brings the spring and brings the summer and brings the fall and brings the winter. I made the 7 stars. You better seek me, not some tree. There's nothing wrong with the swastika because it is the Big Dipper and it's God's creation. Nothing wrong with the North Star. Now, what's amazing is that the priest of Baal wore tall white pointed hats. I'm looking for something on that. And they wore white sheets. Of course, that's where the clan comes from. They white sheets, tall white pointed hats, and they got swastikas on them, don't they? Fire wheels on them. That was the very image of the priest of Baal. I'm looking for why. Don't come up with some empty answer because it might take me 10 years to find it. I'm looking for why they had the pointed hats. Now somebody will say, I know why. It's pointing up to the North Star. I don't know. I want to know why they doing that and why they had on the white sheets. But they studied the stars. That's what the Chaldean magicians of Babylon were. They were the Magi. They studied the stars. And they believed that the stars gave them their crops and filled them up, and God said, I will destroy you for going after the other gods, that you giving them credit for what I gave you. When you read that 2nd chapter of Hosea, I read it once before, but look at that one more time, and then I'll get on with the message. I had to share this with you. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Joel, and Iconium. Find one of those, back up to Hosea. In the 2nd chapter, God's talking about, I read this recently, talking about Israel going after other gods, and Hosea's preaching to them for it, calling Israel a harlot, and he calls the lovers, he calls the idols that Israel went after, the sun worship, the tree worship, or the swastika worship, the fire wheel worship. He calls all of it, he calls these the lovers of Israel. In verse 7, she shall follow after her lovers or her idols, but she shall not overtake them, and she shall seek them, she shall not find them. Then shall she say, I will go and return to my first husband, speaking of God, for then was it better with me than now. For she, Israel, did not know what I gave her corn and wine, not the Queen of Heaven turning the wheel of the year. That's me, God said. And oil, and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal, which was the sun god. And all of that was connected together. Let me show you something. I gave some of you this, and if some of you don't have it, I've got some of these left, and we'll make some more copies. This was a postcard that the Doyles from Wisconsin gave me. It was sent by one of their grandparents to another grandparent. The swastika was directly related to Christ's Mass. It was out of the Feast of Saturn. It's all a convolution of the truth. This was a New Year's card sent in all sincerity, kindest regards, and greetings. Gay, much joy to you this New Year's Day. It has the holly and the greenery. And they hung the holly around their pagan temples and sang the old wassailing bowl song, Deck the halls with boughs of holly. That's a pagan song because they believe those trees were magic. And if you notice, right in the center of this is a swastika. That's a Christmas card. That's a Christmas card out of 1912 in America. Can you see that? That's a Christmas card. Well, let me show you something else, though. If you want one of these, if you didn't get one of these, we got plenty of them up here. We'll make some more. And that's where I blew it up. And Willie did some research. And here's another one. Here's a Christmas card. to wish you, this is out of early America, early 1900s, to wish you many happy days this Christmas. And one of the hangings of the holly in the greenery is a swastika. This was before Adolf Hitler ever got a hold of it. It was called a wheel of peace. It was called the wheel of the year. It was a good luck symbol. In fact, this is another one that Woody found for us on the internet. Swastika. Good luck. This is a postcard in early America. It was mailed by someone, sent out. Swastika with a horseshoe. Swastika with the horseshoe in the middle of it. Swastikas, light, life, love. All through here. And it was a message written to somebody. Goodness. And the Bible has much to say about it. It is the 7 stars. Here's one of the papers says, the true clock of the universe in the form of the swastika. It's on Indian symbols. You can see it on there. Gosh, I've got so much to it. It's in every society, every phase of our society. And then I got things on the Big Dipper here. It is nothing but the Big Dipper. I've got here stuff on swastika. It comes from su, meaning good, and asti, meaning to be. It is good, or it is to be. It has the same meaning as amen. Isn't that something? And I've got all kinds of things. I don't have time to go through all of it. Milky Way, Pleiades. And it is Roman Catholicism is what it is. And here's the Eucharist. There's 8 points on the Roman Catholic Eucharist. It is the will of the Eucharist, what it is. And the peacetime chariots of the Assyrians were 8-spoked wheels. This is an 8-pointed star. It's 8 points to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. What?
Rusty brought you these on the table.
Okay. Okay, and it is also the yin and the yang. I had this. I got this already. The way. Isn't that something? It's called the way. And that's... Okay. Yeah. That's the yin and the yang. Rusty he's been a martial artist. He's kind of a very well-known martial artist. Been a world champion when he was young. He's old now. I don't know what he could... he can't do much now. I tell people, Rusty looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy, but don't you believe that. He's much more than that. He was bad when he was young. He's probably pretty bad now. But I told him one time, I said, Rusty, if somebody ever hits you for the truth, if they swing at you for telling the truth, I said, you're going to have to let them. He went, oh, man. But that's amazing. 8 points. It's the Roman Catholic Eucharist. And Rusty brought this. And what's so funny is people say, that Jim Brown, he's a cult and he's teaching a swastika. Got him on the board. And my son just went down here and he took from Rusty Gray and he presented him with one of these. And it's got the swastika on it. Got the 8-pointed wheel on it. It's got the Xingmu, the Canton Chinese, or the Chinese Madonna riding up on the dragon. That's a convolution of Revelation 17, the harlot riding upon the beast. That's Romanism and Babylonianism riding upon the world beast system. It's in every phase of our society. And they want to get mad at me, and they'll put their kids in a martial arts school and get presented with what I'm preaching. And they're going, phew. Isn't that amazing? Do y'all give these away to people? Or?
No, that's actually something from China.
Oh, is it from China? Well, anyway, what's amazing, it's in every phase and every area of our society. And we think, and I'm studying Polaris right now. I want to know what they thought about Polaris, what the whole idea of it was. It's directly above the earth. What's amazing? Remember Belshazzar? And the Bible speaks of Belshazzar. Lucifer is mentioned one time in the Bible. Lucifer is not Satan. Lucifer is Belshazzar. That's just a proverb against the king of Babylon in the 14th chapter of Isaiah. And Belshazzar says, and of course he is satanically possessed because he's keeping the tree worship and the fire worship of Babylon going, along with the king of Tyre, the prince of Tyre, which is Jezebel and Jezebel's father, prince of Tyre, which is what we call Lebanon today. He kept this going, and it's said about Belshazzar that he said, the scripture says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning," speaking of Belshazzar. And then Belshazzar says, "I will ascend above the sides of the north." And directly north is the North Star, and there's nothing beyond that above us. And I just passing on some information to you. When Jesus comes back, he will come as the lightning shines from the east to the west. The lightning shines, he's not going to come out of the east. I used to think when I was a little kid, and I'd hear my father and preachers preach that, I'd think, oh, he's coming out of the east. Oh, goodness, there's a brightness over there in the east. He's coming. No. Here's the earth. If he comes as the lightning shines out of the east to the west, it's like opening a can. It's like coming out of the north. It's like coming out of this. And like taking the top off and saying, I'm here. That's going to be a frightening thing, but we won't be here long enough to see it. We'll be changed in a moment and in the twinkling of an eye at the last trump. Was that Jim Brown's teaching on witchcraft and all this stuff? No. The problem is people won't go and investigate and find out what all this stuff is about. I want to know, don't you? So if everybody didn't get a copy of the Big Dipper and the North Star, which is the swastika, we got some down here, and you can make some copies of this. I'll put these up here, and if somebody wants to make some copies for everybody after church, here's the copy of that. Clip that. If one of y'all want to do that, just clip that dark part off and make somebody copies of it. And I'll put this over here. Isn't this amazing? Does that amaze y'all as much as it does me? I'm astounded. Huh?
Takes you right back into Revelation.
Oh, and if I actually go into, how can I go into the morning star, the Pleiades? That takes me back into Jesus being the bright morning star, and we received the morning star, and the morning star was the Pleiades, and the Pleiades drew up and brought the sap up in the vine and brought the crops up, and the spiritual Pleiades is the morning star, Christ, and we bear the fruits of the Spirit when we have Christ. And people say God wouldn't do that at things at that exact. He does everything that exact. Now let me get. How long did I take up? How much time do I have left? Whew, I took that much time? Huh? That's how much time I got left? Goodness, maybe I'll be able to say some more. I couldn't wait until next Christmas to give you this. I couldn't even wait till the next time I preached on when I discover something, I can't wait any amount of time. But remember, the difference is the earth's standing here, and I'd like to have, if anybody knows how to make me up a metal thing with the earth and the moon going around it, and maybe the sun out here, and with the swastika or the 4 points of the Big Dipper and the North Star, because that's what they worshipped, and they believed that was bringing the crops. The difference is God's turning the earth. They thought the earth was setting still and needed a goddess to turn the wheel of the year.
Isn't that one amazing how much it looks like a Maltese cross?
It does, yeah. It's just, all of it amazes me. Yeah. All of it. I'm amazed at all of it. I just am astounded. And I've never heard anybody talk about the 7 stars or the Pleiades or what it did or the crops or the sweet influences. People say, sweet influences of Pleiades. See, the stars influence our lives. I do a Gospel in the Stars series. All of it's about Jesus. It's about God. I start to say something, I don't need to even get on it. Because I'll go rattling and I said I'm on prednisone. I've got to get off of that. Get on the subject, okay? All right. Now, where's that paper I gave you? We were sitting at the house the other night, and we've been talking about, we're talking about spring. That's what we're talking about. That's where the Passover was, wasn't it? We're still talking about basically a time period of the Big Dipper. We're talking about the time period of the Big Dipper in the spring, where that was the resurrection time, wasn't it? And that was the resurrection of Tammuz in the ancient world. Notice all this goes together. That was the resurrection of Tammuz after 40 days of mourning. And the Catholics brought that in the church. Maybe that's why they keep trying to cut us off of TV and radio. Because I keep saying these things and said it all goes back. Catholicism goes back to paganism, goes back to the swastika and all. What amazes me, if you saw, I've got pictures of Roman Catholic parades where they're parading the Eucharist, and they got on these tall white pointed hats, and the face is covered with the holes in it, and the white robes, and it looks like the Klan. And Marcus took some to where he worked and showed him some people, and they fired him for it. And I believe he's got a lawsuit.
Yes.
I believe he does if he goes and finds out. And they fired him for it, for showing some pictures of Roman Catholics in their tall white pointed hats and white sheets. And in the third Godfather movie, Al Pacino and the rest of the gang, they've got a parade of Catholic priests with the tall white pointed hats, white sheets, parading the Eucharist with swastikas everywhere, iron crosses everywhere. What? And they're going to fire him for that. Won't they fire Al Pacino for acting in a movie like that and being a Roman Catholic? Is this all nutty? The world is a bunch of wackos, all because we study and find out what the truth is. Now I'm looking for, and you can find, I got to keep revealing to you, you can find that the Roman Catholics worshipped a flaming cross in the ancient world, and the flaming cross is the sign of Tammuz, the cross. This is a form of Tammuz. The swastika, or the Big Dipper in his faces, is called the twisted cross. It's another form of Tammuz. And Tammuz was resurrected in the springtime at this time of the year. That's when Tammuz was resurrected at the Ishtar time, going into spring at Ishtar, and they had a 40-day mourning period for their god among the Franks, and the Catholics brought that in the church and renamed that Lent, and then Tammuz resurrected on March the 25th, which was exactly 9 months before the announcement of before the birth of the sun god. On December the 25th, exactly 9 months, he was resurrected, and then he dies and is reborn December the 25th, the birthday of Mithra in the ancient world. Now you can find in the two Babylons the flaming cross. Well, the flaming cross, since it's Roman Catholic, that's why the Klan will burn a cross in your yard, because they are the priests of Baal. But the Masons come out of the same thing. Christmas, Masons, Shriners, Muslims, they're all brothers and they don't even know it.
Would this be considered?
That's a sign of Tammuz, yeah.
Oh my God.
Oh my God. I'm not going to get mad because you got one on. I don't wear a cross. Did you know that when I was a little boy in the late 40s, not just crucifixes, only Roman Catholics wore crosses? We've adapted that over. Now, in this, you'll find the flaming cross among the Catholics. And in Mr. Edersheim's history of Israel, you will find the tall white pointed hats that they wore. In fact, he says in the book, in his history of Israel, when Elijah meets the priest of Baal, he said they look somewhat ridiculous, dressed in their tall white pointed hats and their white robes as Elijah faced them on Mount Carmel. So you'll find that in the history. So what I do is I get something out of this book, something out of this book. Y'all know how long I've been studying this? And I'm still looking for why they wore the white pointed hats. By the way, during the December 17th through the 24th, they had this was the feast of Saturn, or the festival of the Lord of Misrule, and they would take this festival and they would take a bum off the street, a poor person. They would take a fool and put him in charge of this festival, and all of the government would be turned upside down. The king would serve the fool for the 7 days, and they would all have all kinds of orgies and all kinds of promiscuity. And the head of the festival of the Lord of Misrule would wear the fool's hat. The dunce hat. That's why they stick the kid in the corner and say, wear this hat, you're the dunce, you're the fool, you can't learn anything. And that comes out of this too. And that's actually, gosh, it's convoluted with the fish's mouth. The open fish's mouth, that's the mitre of the Pope. And that's the deification of Noah as Dagon, the fish god. And Dog is the word fish in the Hebrew. And they deified Noah. They took something righteous and made it unrighteous. Oh, there's nothing wrong with God's swastika, or with God's Big Dipper, or God's Ursa Minor, and God's North Star. God said, that's me that did that. You gave me some paganism credit for what I'm doing? Well, you think that there's nothing wrong with the swastika because it is the Big Dipper and the North Star. You think there's something wrong with what God created? God's saying you're making something evil out of it.
That shows you what happens when we insert our opinion.
When we put our opinion in, and that's all they did, they stuck an opinion in. God said, that's my Big Dipper. Man gets wild with his imagination. He goes crazy, doesn't he? We've made Christmas good, and we made God's creation evil.
He said that when they went down to battle.
Nothing will be restrained from them which they've imagined to do. All right. Now, I gave you a paper here. Was at the house the other night. I'm teaching on the Passover. And Passover comes in the spring at Ostara. At Ostara, or Easter, or Ishtar, or at the resurrection of Tammuz. Jesus resurrected on the first day of the week. And he resurrected the third day he was in the tomb. And we're studying that. That was at the Passover in the spring. By the way, the word spring, when you look it up in your Webster's dictionary, it means resurrection. That's what it means. It means to spring up or to resurrect. Now, we were sitting there at the house, and Wendy asked me, sometimes your questions prod me into messages, into explanation of messages. I gave you these notes. She said, why is it important to know which day of the week Jesus died? And I've got to give you the notes. I'm just kind of run through them real quick. And I was sitting around scratching, so that was scratching. I was under the influence of prednisone, and I was just scratching. Just wasn't even worrying about whether I was doing it. And after a while, I said, I think I'll make these and give them to people. So I tried to be a little clear on the second page. I was just doing my scratching here. And I put mainly, why is it important to know what day of the week that Jesus died? Mainly because it is Jewish. Everything about his death was Jewish. All the New Testament is Jewish. I'm going to give you some notes on why the New Testament is Jewish. I gave you some here. I'm going to go through Revelation and write them up and give them to you next week on why Revelation is a Jewish book. The church is Jewish. Circumcision was a term for Jews. I'm just going down. That's because God said, I'll be your God, you'll be my people, Abraham, in Genesis 17. I'll give you the land, and it will bear crops, and it'll be me that does it, not the swastika. Well, it'll be the swastika, but it's not the swastika. It's the Big Dipper, and it's me turning the earth taking it through its season. Circumcision was a term for Jews because when that covenant was given to Abraham, God said, here will be your sign of the covenant. You will be circumcised the foreskin of the flesh. So therefore, the descendants of Abraham were called the circumcision. Uncircumcision was a term for Gentiles. And Paul says in Galatians, the 2nd chapter, verse 7, I'm just going down the line, that he says the uncircumcision or the Gentiles were committed to me. That's why all of Paul's books, Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, all of these were written to, well, not Acts, but Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Timothy, Titus, Philemon, all of these were written to Gentiles. And he says the circumcision was given to Peter. The Jews was given to Peter. That's not that Peter didn't preach to some of the Gentiles. He did. It's not like Paul didn't preach to some of the Jews. He did. But that was their main calling. Then Philippians 3:3. Paul tells the Philippian Gentile church, and I've said this to y'all many times. Here's the criteria for being a spiritual Jew. Paul writes the Philippian church and says, you Philippian Gentiles up here in the Macedon Empire, up here on the northern part of Greece, considered to be the cruder part of the Grecian people, a bunch of rednecks up there. That's what Philippians were considered. Instead of the rednecks being in the south, they were in the north in Greece. And we are the circumcision, he says, you and me. I'm a Jew, you're a Gentile, but we, me and you, are the circumcision, the spiritual Israel, the spiritual Jew. And here's the criteria for being a spiritual Jew. We worship God in spirit, we rejoice in Christ Jesus, and we have no confidence in the flesh. Now, I'll go into those 3 points another time. Then in Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, still talking to a Gentile church, verses 11 through 19. I've never heard this preached on in my life. This is why everything in the Bible is Jewish. It's arranged by God. I put high points or key points to these verses. The Gentiles were called uncircumcision at the beginning in verse 11. By circumcision in the flesh made by hands. And he stipulates there's a circumcision made by hands and a circumcision made without hands that makes you a spiritual Jew. He says you Gentiles were aliens from the commonwealth or from the citizenship of the community of Israel, speaking to this Ephesian Gentile church. And you were strangers from God's covenant to Abraham in Genesis 17. And you were without God. You were far off from Israel. But you were made nigh to Israel by blood baptism. Remember, before Jesus died and before the handwriting of ordinances were nailed to the cross, if you wanted to become an Israelite and you were a Gentile, you had to go through 3 things. A circumcision, a washing in water. This was a proselyte process and offering 2 turtle doves. And Jesus made the Jew and Gentile one spiritually. All of these are high points in these verses. He abolished fleshly ordinances, the same thing as Colossians 2:14, nailed the ordinances to the cross, the literal Jew to the cross. Now it's all spiritual Israel, spiritual kingdom of God. He made both one new man, one body, one spirit. Does everybody have one of these papers? You don't have one of these, do you, Ben? Well, you can get one. Get him one back there. Where's that stack of papers? Anybody that doesn't have one, pass them out one of those. Give him one of those swastika papers, too. One of those firewheel, one of those Big Dipper papers. Called it that. Big Dipper doesn't sound as bad as swastika, does it? Same thing. Same thing, yeah. All right. And then point number 9. He made both one new man, both Jew and Gentile, and one body. In the body's the church, and there's only one body, Ephesians 4 and 5. One spirit, and then number 10. He says, now you Ephesian Gentile church, you're no more strangers to Israel. How in the world could we not be strangers and not be spiritual Jews? We're no longer strangers to Israel. We're part of Israel. How in the world can Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, even be read and men not understand that? He says, but we're fellow citizens of what country? Israel, spiritual. In Ephesians, the 3rd chapter continues the thought from the 2nd chapter. Paul says, the mystery that has been hidden through the ages, I'm a prisoner of Jesus Christ, and I'm a minister according to this mystery. And here's the mystery, that the Gentiles should be fellow heirs of what? Of Israel with the Jews. Of the same body. But Israel is not going to Israel because they're born Israelites. They have to come through Jesus Christ, so they got to become a part of spiritual Israel. And we're partakers of the promise. What does that refer to? The covenant to Abraham, isn't it? And then I put insert Galatians 3:7. We're children of Abraham by faith. Well, if we're children of Abraham, that makes us spiritual Jews, doesn't it? And we're spiritual Israel in Galatians 6:15-16. God's Israel are those who walk according to the rule of a new creation, and circumcision nor uncircumcision availeth nothing. Then Hebrews 12:22. We're spiritual Mount Zion. It's spelled with an S. In the New Testament, it's spelled with a Z when the Old Testament is translated. What I'm saying, the reason we need to know what day Jesus died, it's defined according to Jewry. It's Jewish. The church is Israel. Israel is the church. In Acts 7:37 and 38, Stephen is standing before the Sanhedrin, relating to the Sanhedrin, the 70 judging council in Jerusalem, the story of the fathers of Israel, and he talks about Israel coming out of Egypt, and he says that there's a prophet that God will raise up unto you, and he said this prophet was with the church in the wilderness. He calls Israel in the wilderness while they're wandering. He calls them the Ecclesia. That is the word church, the called out. How in the world can you have Israel called a church and them not be the church? That's ridiculous, isn't it? Then, Jerusalem that's Jewish, isn't it? Jerusalem, city of peace. Galatians 4:26, Jerusalem is our mother. She's the mother of us all. She's the mother of the Galatian Gentile church. How in the world could she be the mother of a Galatian Gentile church and the Galatian Gentile church and not be Jewish? How? Galatia was 4 cities up here that Paul went to. Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra up here in what we call Turkey. I think that's a Gentile area, isn't it? How could they be called Jerusalem being the mother of them? That's because they were birthed by these apostles sent out by Jerusalem, and they became part of spiritual Israel, didn't they? Well, the Galatian Gentile church is not just Galatia, it's us too, isn't it? Amazing, isn't it? Jerusalem is the church in Hebrews 12:20. I remind you, heavenly Jerusalem, the church of the firstborn. And then all Gentiles becoming Israelites have to go through the proselyte process. A new baby born into Israel had to go through circumcision, washing in water, and sacrifice. Colossians 2, the Gentile church was spiritual circumcision, spiritual baptism. And then the last page, not the last page, but the last 2 pages. What have we learned about the Jewishness of the day Jesus died? All right, what have we learned? The reason we need to understand everything in the New Testament is Jewish, because it goes back to Jewish culture. And I want to show you something that's just utterly amazing, that as I was writing these notes down last night, I thought, this is something. What we've learned, Passover in Nisan, that's in the springtime. That's over here on the Swastika, on the Big Dipper, isn't it? We've learned that Jesus died on Friday. He died on the preparation day of the Sabbath in John 19:31. It was a Jewish thing that a body could not remain upon a cross on the Sabbath. So it was the day of preparation. Being the day of preparation, that was the day before the Sabbath. That was Jewish law that they couldn't remain upon the cross in Deuteronomy 21:23. So Jesus, has to be Friday because they got to get him off the cross in the ground before the Sabbath gets there at 6 o'clock that evening. In the day of preparation for the Sabbath, here's some things they had to do. All bodies had to be off crosses. That was Jewish. Therefore, they had to break the legs to keep them from exhaling. We said, let me erase some of this. And y'all got all this, I guess. My board ain't erasing. Maybe y'all can see it. Erase this. I'll leave that fire wheel up over there. All right. We've said it's Jewish not to break the legs because they crucified him on this stipes. They had learned that through the years that they had to bury this in the ground, and they didn't carry the cross piece. They did not carry this with. They didn't carry the whole thing with them. They only carried the cross piece, the patibulum. They just carried the patibulum, which was the cross piece, and they tied it around the man's shoulders. They tied it around the man's shoulders, and they tied it around his shoulders here, put ropes around his shoulders. His hands hung down like this, and it got too heavy for Jesus. And then they would take and twist it and put it a notch up here. He had a footrest, and the footrest they had honed this to a scale. Let me read this, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. This astounds me because I hit something that just boggled my mind. On the day of preparation, the legs were not broken from exhaling. Jesus was the Passover lamb, and the Passover lambs could not be broken. No bone could be broken. His legs could not be broken, or everything about the Passover would have been a lie, and Jesus wouldn't have been the lamb. This is Jewish in Exodus 12:46. The Jewish law is no bone of a Passover lamb could be broken, therefore, and they had to break their legs because they had to rise up in order to exhale. They could inhale, but they couldn't exhale, and they had, due to the way their body was contorted, they couldn't exhale. And they would suffocate if they couldn't raise themselves up, so they'd break their legs. Well, I wrote this next section here, and I got to thinking about it. Now, here's the sovereignty of God. The Roman Empire, Israel left 1450. They left Egypt around 1450 BC. Now, Rome had been in the making and in the building for a long time. In the 6th century, the Roman Republic began. The Republic of Rome began. And long before that, the city of Rome was built. But the Roman Empire that began to crucify men did not begin until 27 BC. That's when the Roman Empire began. And that's where they began to crucify people. It's only about 60 years later, at the death of Christ, they had really honed this crucifying people to a skill. So Rome had only been crucifying people. They'd crucified people long before this, but they hadn't honed it until you're getting to the time of Christ, where they could really get it down to torture a man. And I want you to notice what I've written here. God, therefore, through the centuries prior to Christ, had to manipulate the minds of the Romans in their perfecting the cross as a torture device. God had to work the minds of the Romans so that they developed it. I write fast and I don't put my Y on some of my days. It's supposed to be a Y there. So that they developed it in the fashion in which they did. With the patibulum placed in the notches of the stipes in order to disjoint Jesus' body. Don't you understand what I'm saying? God has to work in the Roman minds to get his body disjointed long before he's crucified. While they're developing the cross, he's got to be working in our minds, if for no other reason, to develop the cross this way so Jesus will be disjointed, because the only way they could eat the Passover lamb was disjointing it. They wouldn't break anything. They'd disjoint the joints and pass it around people to take a bite off of it. So God's got to manipulate the Roman minds to make the cross this way. They got to discover the people of Carthage and the people of Phoenicia kept dropping them down in holes. They kept flying off the cross. And the Romans said, we'll figure out a way to make men, to torture them longer and better, pop their bones out of joint. Some guy come up and says, I figured this out. We can get a man's bones out of joint by hanging him up here and pulling this patibulum back and crooking it in this notch a certain way, and we'll make his bones out of joint. And he doesn't even know that he's prophesying the death of the Passover lamb, Christ, while he's making this invention. You understand what I'm saying? Now that is sovereignty. He's going to make these men do evil things to bring about the righteousness of God. I don't know how else to say that. If you don't believe in predestination, you won't even like this. Where was I? God was pushing it. Let me read that again. With the patibulum placed in the notches of the stipes in order to disjoint Jesus' body and have the footrest so they would break their legs, God was pushing it in the face of the Romans and the Jews that no bone could be broken of the Passover. He was saying, in your face, wasn't he? Of the Passover lamb, by the fact that Jesus was dead already when they came around to break his legs in order to get him in the grave before 6 o'clock. God put it in their minds to make the cross that way, and God had him dead so they couldn't break his legs, so he would be the Passover lamb. So they say, he's dead already, we can't break his legs. We don't need to break his legs, just pull him down and put him in the grave. If they'd have broke his legs, it would have invalidated salvation, it would have invalidated everything. He wouldn't have been the Passover lamb. A bone couldn't be broken, he had to be disjointed. So God had to work their minds to create the cross that way. If that's not the sovereignty of God, I don't know what is. The beginning of the Sabbath. This is Jewish, isn't it? The Bible is Jewish law. It is Jewish culture, all arranged by God in his cosmos, his orderly arrangement, the word world in John 3:16. The Roman development of crucifixion on a cross was ordained in the mind and thinking in order to fulfill Jewish Passover, where Jesus will be crucified. This is God working all things after the counsel of his own will in Ephesians 1:11, isn't it? Including the evil in men's minds. He was ordaining those guys to, and gosh, you know how many things that takes me to? I think of the Assyrian war chariots and their 6-spoked wheels, which is a picture of the Star of David. And then I think of Ephesians, of Acts 4:28, when they were gathered there that day to kill Jesus. The Romans were there, piercing his side, screaming, "If your God come down!" And they were killing him. They were murdering an innocent man, and the Jews are screaming, "Crucify him! His blood be on our heads. We'll commit murder to get rid of him." That's what blood be on our heads meant. And Herod was there, and Pilate was there, and they were killing an innocent man. And they were therefore to do with their evil minds and their evil thoughts. They were there doing the will of God. They were there for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. They were doing God's will. Determined before is the word prohorizo, predestinate. God predestinated the murder of Jesus by the hands of evil men by manipulating the very thoughts of their wicked minds for generations, for hundreds of years. God ordained everybody to be there that day. We've also learned that on the day of preparation, the day Jesus died, the Jews had to do three things. They had to pay the tithe, and they had the ubric set up. That was a place set up for Sabbath dwelling, all food and dwelling. And they couldn't leave. They could only go so far. And you can look up. Here's a good thing you can look up here. Go to your S volume. Let me see if I can find it quickly. This is what this is good for. I like to have these encyclopedias up here. Go to Sabbath. Go take your McClintock and Strong. Encyclopedia. Fantastic set of books. Go to Sabbath. Let me see here. Sabbath. All right, Sabbath. Hold on. Sabbath day's journey. And that's what the ubric was for. That you would set up. You'd set up food. You could go so far and set up food, but you had to stay in that spot. The Sabbath wasn't for driving a car and going somewhere to church and then going eating at a restaurant. Sabbath was to go home and stay there and rest. That's what it's for.
Now this is on halakha also.
Huh?
Halakha. These three things on halakha.
Well, yeah, but some of the halakha, Jesus would accept that. Jesus didn't reject all halakha. He rejected the halakha that would change the Word of God. He accepted the proselyte baptism because he was washed in water, and it was to introduce him to Israel. John said, I came baptizing so that Christ might be made manifest to Israel, because they wouldn't listen to you if you were from some other nation. And they thought he was from Samaria, and they kept calling him a Gentile, and they called him a Samaritan. But if he was washed in water, so he accepted that halakha. He said, well, that comes out of the washing of the priesthood. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. So we'll go ahead and be washed in water. And they said in their halakha that if a man was washed in water and he was circumcised and 2 turtle doves were offered, they had to accept him into their fellowship, and they had to listen to him if he was a teacher. He said, this will shut their mouths. People say, well, Jesus washed in water. It was proselyte baptism. He didn't have to, but he did it to shut their mouths and say, now you have to listen to me according to your own law. I accept that part of the halakha. Huh? That's right. Well, when you go into the Sabbath day's journey, a Sabbath day's journey, you couldn't go over a Sabbath day's journey in this ubric. Distance of a Sabbath day's journey and its origin. From the injunction in Exodus 16:29 that every man is to abide in his place. Now people say, we're Sabbath keepers. We are, go home. Don't drive around on Saturday if you're a Sabbath keeper, and don't cook nothing, and definitely do not go in a restaurant and contribute to somebody else breaking the Sabbath by having them cook for you and wait on you. Because you had to have your food sitting there, and you couldn't do nothing but pick it up and eat it, and that's it. Couldn't be cooked. You couldn't go anywhere to get it. It had to be fixed. That's part of the preparation of the Sabbath. Abide in a place and not go out of his place. Oh, you couldn't have any entertainment. You couldn't watch any football. You know, no entertainment of any sort. You rested the Sabbath. See, people that say they're Sabbath keepers, they're really not. The Sabbath is every day now. We rest in the things of God, all that he's ordaining. The ancient Hebrew legislators deduced that an Israelite must not go 2,000 yards or 12,000 handbreadths. At the ancient Hebrew yard consisted of 6 handbreadths, 5 Greek stadia. We get the word stadium from that. That's the length around a track. For the Greek stadium measured 2,400 handbreadths beyond the temporary or permanent place of his abode. Epiphanius' definition of the Sabbath day's journey at 6 stadia 14,400 handbreadths, or 750 Roman geographical paces. Now, if you're going to keep the Sabbath, you need to get a copy of this and make sure you don't go this far past your house, okay? And be sure you got food over there sitting where you're going to go. Is most probably based upon the larger yard when the Jews adopted at the later period, and it goes on about the Sabbath day's journey. I just thought I'd read that to you. All right, now where was I? And why is it necessary? We've also learned that they had to light a candle. There, number 3, light a candle, began at 6 o'clock. Is that Jewish? Well, yeah, the day began at 6 o'clock. And they had to do these 3 things before the Sabbath begins. Jesus is crucified on Friday. And they got to get him off the cross into the grave because the Sabbath is coming. The Sabbath is drawing on. That's what Luke 23 and 54 says. And the word draw on, they had to light the candle. This was the Sabbath drawing on, the lighting of the candle. In Luke 23:54, draw on is the word epiphosko, E-P-I, P-H-O-S-K-O. Epiphosko. That's Jewish, isn't it? If you're going to find out why is it necessary to know what day Jesus died, I appreciate y'all asking me questions sometimes. It provokes me to do something like this. Or commenting and saying, I really like what you said on this or that. Because it makes me want to sit down and say, let me help you. Let me write these notes down. Epiphosko means to shine. Draw on doesn't mean, I've had people say, well, the Sabbath drew on. It can mean to dawn. That word epiphosko can mean to dawn, but it means to shine. The Sabbath didn't begin shining at 6 o'clock or at dawn the next morning. That's not when it began to shine. It began to shine at 6 o'clock in the evening. Actually, before 6 o'clock, while it was still daylight, the Sabbath began to shine because they had to have the candle lit before 6 o'clock. And it's usually, well, of course, in the spring, it would definitely be light. In the summer. So the Sabbath would begin to shine. And this was in the springtime when Jesus is resurrected. And in Israel, it's light at 6 o'clock. Or before 6 o'clock. Isn't it? Certainly it is. Man, 6 o'clock, the sun's high in the sky. Over there and over here. But the Sabbath began to dawn or to shine when they lit the candle. And they had to have it lit before 6 o'clock. That's Jewish, isn't it? Why is it necessary to know anything in the New Testament? Why is it necessary to study the intricate details? It's all Jewish and God's got it arranged. I'll give you some Jewish things on Revelation next week, and I've taught them on the Revelation series. How much time do I have, Mike? 34. Okay. All right. Now. 24. Got so many things to go to. Now, where was I? Now, this is not all we've learned. Meaning to shine. Sabbath did not dawn in the morning, but before 6 o'clock the evening before, when the Sabbath candles were lit. I think that's Jewish, isn't it? Everything that happened when Jesus died was Jewish. It was a Jewish Passover. It was a Jewish feast. Wasn't it? Now we've learned all these things. We have learned concerning the day Jesus died that a part of a day was the whole of a day. Haven't we? Synecdoche is a term that Jews use to express this. He died on the... Did I put he died? I'm sorry. He resurrected on the 3rd day. Y'all changed that. I was writing, kind of my head was off somewhere out in space. He resurrected. I told you I was on medication. Resurrected. I changed mine. Y'all better change yours before you read that and somebody, what? He died on the 3rd day. Well, y'all know what I meant, didn't you? Okay. All right. If you read ahead of me. Sometimes I'm right and I'm talking so far ahead of myself. All right, he resurrected on the 3rd day, not after 72 hours, 3 days and 3 nights. We've talked about that. This is Jewish. Goodness sakes. And it's not just on days, and you can't use it on anything you want to. One fellow said, well, the tithe is God wants 100% of your money, and that's the tithe, and that's 100. That's a part. 10% is a part of the whole. That's foolishness. 100% of the tithe is 10% of what you make. That's 100% of the tithe. Not the tithe is not 100% of what you make. God wanted it committed to Him, and 10% is a part, and that's the whole. That's twisting and perverting. It's not true. We do believe in the tithe here. It is not spiritual. The Bible calls the tithe a carnal thing and calls offering. People say the tithe is done away with. The tithe is classed with the offerings. How will a man rob God in tithes and offerings? Some will say, the tithe's done away with and we just give offerings. Well, if the tithes were done away with, why aren't the offerings done away with? Huh? Isn't that crazy? It's not true. I'll go back and teach on that again. The tithe is a carnal thing according to the 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians. I ain't even going to argue about that. That's foolish to say anything other than that. All right, now, where was I? All right. He resurrected the third day, not after 72 hours. And let me just, one more time. He said repeatedly. Didn't he say that repeatedly in Matthew 16, 21, 17, 23, 20, and 19, 27, and 64? Mark 9, 31, Mark 10, 34, Luke 9, 22, Luke 13, 32, Luke 18, 33, Luke 24, 21, Luke 24, 46, that he resurrected the third day, Acts 10, 40, and 1 Corinthians 15, 4. He resurrected the third day. And the confusion comes with people is where Jesus said in Matthew, the 12th chapter and verse 40, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And let me just say it one more time so you can understand. Jesus died on Friday, just because the Catholics brought that in the church and called it Good Friday, it doesn't make it a Catholic holiday. Catholics stumble into the truth once in a while, just like the Pharisees stumbled into the truth once in a while, and Jesus would hold on to those truths. Jesus died on a Friday, but synecdoche. Synecdoche is a Jewish term, and it meant a part of something was the whole. A part was whole. But you can't use this in every case. And they use this. We use that. We use a part as the whole. If I said I spent the day with Gerald, I don't mean I spent 24 hours with Gerald, do I? No, that's not what I mean. I meant I went over and spent 6 or 7 hours with him. I would say, even 4 hours, I'd say, I spent the day with Gerald. Oh, you did? What'd you do? Well, we went fishing, came home, and I cleaned some fish, and we cooked and ate them. And I was gone in 4 hours. Well, to us, that's the day, isn't it? I don't mean 24 hours. So, Jesus died on Friday, the day of preparation. That's Jewish. They had to break the legs. But Jesus was a Passover lamb. His legs, no bones broken. So he had to be dead when they got there on Friday because the Sabbath was coming, and they had to prepare for the Sabbath and do 3 things: the ubric, the tithe, and what's the other one? Candles. Yeah, that's right. Gosh, how could I forget that? All right. Then, Jesus had to be in the grave before 6 o'clock because they couldn't have anybody there, or before sundown. And they had 2 evenings, and that's Jewish for sundown. They had 2 evenings when the sun set and actually when it got dark. And this was called the 2 evenings that's Jewish. Well, if Jesus was in the grave, at 5:45, they had to count not just that 15 minutes, but they had to count from 6 o'clock back to 6 o'clock on Thursday evening. But 6 o'clock Thursday evening was not Thursday, was it? 6 o'clock Thursday evening was the beginning of Friday. I keep saying this. Get our calendar out of your head. You can't think Jewish by thinking 12 midnight. You know what? We're so shallow. We think the day begins at sunup. Don't we? Well, the sun rose and the day began. No, it didn't. It began last night at midnight. When I say we're on TV Friday morning at midnight, I mean Thursday night comes, midnight gets here. That's Friday morning. But we can't get that in our heads, can we? We think for some reason Friday morning is when the sun comes up. It's not. And I'm telling you something you know, but you don't even think about it sometimes. So Thursday evening at 6 o'clock was Friday. That was the day of preparation, and that's the night that Jesus ate. He said, I desire to eat the Passover with my disciples. We certainly didn't eat it the next day. He's being killed not the next day, the same day during the daylight. He's being killed that same day during the daylight, what we would call the next day. He's being killed, and he doesn't eat it sometime about noon the next day. He's being killed at noon I even say it. I can't get out of saying it the next day. It's not the next day. It's the same day, isn't it? They're eating that night, later that day during the daylight. Let me put it that way. During the daylight, they're eating the last Passover. They're not eating crackers and grape juice. How ridiculous. This is Jewish. The reason people can't find out that this is Jewish is because they're going to some church of Christ and they're passing around crackers and grape juice. Jesus took the bread and said, this bread is my body. This is the church. This is spiritual Passover I'm instituting. So they had to count, if he's in the grave at 5:45 or right before sundown, they have to count that entire day back to Thursday when actually Friday began. And then he's in the grave all day Saturday. So they got to count, you got a full day there. And then he resurrects sometime Sunday morning. And sometime Sunday morning, during the dark, first day of the week, and we know he rose the Sunday morning because when he's walking on the road that day in the afternoon with the two men on the road to Emmaus, there in the 24th chapter of Luke, he says to them, they say to him, do you not know what's been going on? He said, what? They said, well, this man that they killed, and he's rose from the dead, and he's the Christ, and he's the Messiah. And he said, I didn't know nothing about it. It's Jesus talking to him. So they talked to him about it, and they said, and it was the first day of the week, and they said, is not this the third day since these things happened? So he rose on Sunday, which was the third day from when he was in the tomb, but he wasn't in there. He wasn't in there full 24 hours the third day. He wasn't in there full 24 hours the first day, but they had to count the full 24 hours the first day. They had to count the full 20 hours the third day. That's called synecdoche, and you had 24 hours on the Saturday, so that's the 3 days and 3 nights apart being the whole. Does everybody understand that? That's not hard. It's the same thing as, I've said it before, they give that little whistle on the Navy ship and the captain says, all hands on deck. Now hear this, all hands on deck. He doesn't mean everybody bring your hands, cut your hands off and bring them up on the deck and lay them down on the deck. Does he? A part is the whole. He means everybody get up here. And we do. Now, I threw in some of the notes. Gosh, how much more can I put down? Jesus rose on the first day of the week, which is the third day in the tomb in Luke 24:1 and 21. Now, maybe that'll help give some answers. Now, I want us to go back. Let me show you something. I'm going to go through all these chapters. How much time, Mike? I don't even know where I can get going here. 12 minutes. Let me show you what we're going to have to study. I'm going to talk to you. Just talk to you. We've been talking about the Passover, which comes in the springtime, by the way. I keep pointing back over here to the Big Dipper in the spring, the swastika in the spring. I'm going to start calling the Big Dipper the swastika. I'm going to start calling Swastika the Big Dipper. All right, now, I think that's fantastic to see this. And it just thrills me just stopping thinking about this. And that's God's covenant of bringing food in the spring. And they resurrected Tammuz. And boy, let me show you what I'm going to try to be showing you. I'm going to try to show you the harmony of the Gospels. Let me erase this. Y'all got this, don't you? All right. Now, let me see here. What we're going to have to do, we've been studying Passover. Passover and how Christmas was a pollution of the Passover. When Jesus said, except you eat my flesh and drink my blood, speaking of the Passover, and flesh being meat indeed is the word alethes, A-L-E-T-H-E-S. And alethes means of truth. Boy, we've corrupted everything. We're talking about the Passover. Now the Passover, you find the Passover in Matthew 26, where Jesus is taking bread and he's saying, this is my body, and he's taking the cup. The body is the church. To drink of a cup meant to undergo a violent death. And that's what Jesus spoke of his cross as a cup. Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. Now that was a death. Now the Passover is in Matthew 26. Let me put it this way. It's in Mark 14, and it's in Luke 22. Luke 22. Now this is the night before Jesus dies, the same day, which is 12 hours so later. The same day. We would call it the next day, but it's the same day. Well, it's hard to say that, isn't it? It's the same day. So they're eating that night, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right, now, John 13, Luke 22. Now, these are all last Passover, the night before Jesus dies, that same day, during the daylight part of the day. So Jesus is going to die 12 or so hours later. So they're eating the last Passover. So in order to study these, there's called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic, we get the word synonymous. Synoptic from synonymous. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They have similar views on chapters. So what we got to do in order to study the resurrection of Christ, we've got to study the next chapters to study his crucifixion, don't we? And his crucifixion has to do with the breaking of the legs, which is Jewish, being in the grave before the Sabbath, which is that next night, that next evening at 6 o'clock, Sabbath begins. I don't know how people can't see this. And then I'm going to show you what we're going to do here. I got to take Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I don't know if I have enough room here. Let me put it like this. Luke 22 and Mark 13. Put that over here. Luke 22 and Mark 13. John 13. What am I doing? Y'all help me. John 13. Now, John 13 is the last, that's the night of the last Passover. So John 13, they're having boy, this looks like funny when you look at that because John has 21 chapters. So John 13 is the last Passover. And then Jesus has a discourse with his apostles all the way through 16. And 17, that same night, he's going into the garden and praying his prayer. I pray not for the world, I pray for those whom thou hast given me, the elect. And he's sweating great drops of blood. And then they're taking him in 18 and 19. And they're killing him in 19. He's resurrecting in 20. And in 21, he appears to the apostles. So this is Friday night to Sunday morning from 13 to 21. You understand what I'm saying? Lots of the discourses of Christ. You remember 14? Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. That's a discourse to the apostles. That's the word spoken to the wife, the Jewish wife. That's Jewish. And you get into John 15. I am the true vine, you're the branches. He's still talking to them. He's talking to them, talking to them, talking to them. Going to the garden and praying. 14, 15, and 16 is all one discourse during that last Passover. When he says, let not your heart be troubled, he's there at the table with them talking to them. When he's talking about in John 15, I'm the vine, you're the branches. If the world hate me, it'll hate you. He's sitting at the last Passover saying that. When he's saying, there in John 16, he said they'll think they do God's service when they kill you. And he goes on to say, when the Spirit of truth has come, he'll guide you into all truth. That's all one speech to them at the Passover supper. So we need to study all that, see. And then he goes to the garden. Then they take him, and then they crucify him, and then he resurrects. Then he appears to his apostles, and he tells Peter, feed my sheep there in 21. So this is all within a day and a half period. That's hard to grasp that, I know. Because all of the rest of this happens in a few chapters at the end of these books. So these are the synoptic gospels. Now, we're going to have to go into... Oh gosh, I've got it written on this piece of paper. I don't know if I have time to even get to it. You get into Matthew 26. Before 26, let me put this on the board this way. Matthew 21 is Jesus comes into Jerusalem. Jesus enters Jerusalem. Jerusalem on a young colt. This is 4 days before the Passover because the lamb has to be taken into the house and examined 4 days. So this has to be 4 days. And this is one of the reasons he couldn't be crucified on Wednesday, because Wednesday would put him coming to Jerusalem on that previous Saturday, which is the Sabbath. And the literal Sabbath hasn't been nailed, the rituals haven't been nailed to the cross yet, and he doesn't have any business working on the Sabbath and causing people to cut down a bunch of branches and him riding on a young colt. He would have been coming in violating the Sabbath if he had been crucified on Wednesday. There's no way that can be true. That's terrible theology. Then, people who believe that, I don't know what they're thinking. Just everything has to go according to Jewish culture. Then Matthew 23. That's Jesus' discourse. Remember this? To Pharisees. This is right before they take him. This right here is the speech he makes that makes them so mad. That's the one people say, who killed Jesus? Well, it's the Jews that killed Jesus. It was the Pharisees and their fight with him over their halakha. This was the final straw. Matthew 23 was it. They said, that's it, you're dead for this. Because that's where he called them a children of hell, called generation of vipers. They said, we'll get you. And boy, they did. That's the super speech right there to the Pharisees. Then Matthew 24. That's Matthew 24 is the prophecy chapter. He is discoursing. He leaves the Pharisees, talks to his apostles and says, the time will come when one stone will not be left. They said, come out and look at the great temple. He says, the time will come when one stone will not be left upon another. They said, what will these things be, and what will be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Well, this chapter goes with Mark 13. That's the same chapter in Mark. And that goes with Luke, the 21st chapter. Luke 21, 21st chapter. These are synonymous chapters. These are the prophecy chapters, and I'm going to go into these in the 70-week series on Sunday night. I'm going to tie 13 of Mark, 24 of Matthew, and 21 of Luke. I'm going to start tonight. Now, we've been in the 70-week series 10 or 12 weeks, something like that. Then you've got Matthew 25, same discourse of prophecy, just continuing with the apostles. And then 26, last Passover. 27, all Matthew. Judas repents, feels sorry. Now, he doesn't have true repentance. Judas he says, I betrayed innocent blood. And people say, Judas repented, he must have gone to heaven. No, his prayer was sin from the beginning. It was ordained. It was damnation, according to Psalms 109. And it better that man had never been born that betrayed Christ. I don't think God said that about elect, did he? No, didn't say that about elect. And it wasn't true repentance. He was just sorry. He was fleshly sorry he had done something to an innocent man. And one of the fruits of the Spirit is not love, joy, peace, suicide. That's not one of the fruits of the Spirit. Judas said, I love Jesus so much I'm going to go commit suicide. Yeah. And then Judas, and that's in Christ's crucifixion, crucified. And then 28, Jesus appears to apostles. That's the last thing he does. And gives the Great Commission, go into all the world and teach all nations, baptizing them with my baptism. Now, all these have corresponding chapters in Mark and Luke. So we got to study these chapters here. What I'm going to do is go to the last Passover and study the following chapters that tie together with these here. So when you get to Mark, Mark 11. Let me put this down here. Mark 11. I have to put this down here. Mark 11 is Jesus heads to Jerusalem. This is going to correspond with Matthew 21, and that corresponds with Luke 19. That's where he's on the young colt of an ass. Matthew 21, Luke 19, young colt of an ass, Mark 11. So you got to study those together. That's called harmony of gospels. They harmonize. And you're going to see some things in Mark that you won't see in Matthew. You'll see things in Matthew that you won't see in Mark's accounts. And you'll see things in Luke that you don't see in these over here. That's why you got to study the three together when you study. That's why it's that important. It's that important. And as we go through this, as I go through these prophecy chapters, Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13, we're going to study those together in this 70 weeks. And then you get into Mark 11, Mark 12. That's Jesus' discourse with his apostles. The same thing. The same thing is up here when he's in 24. And that's the same thing he's doing up here. He's doing in Luke. He's having his discourse at the last Passover in 22. He's having most of his discourse in 22. He shows more of his discourse here in John than any over here. He shows the next amount of discourse in Matthew 24, and he shows less discourse in Mark and less discourse in Luke. You get the discourse with his apostles in John more than anywhere else at the last Passover. I'll try to write it down on paper. Have I run out of time? Huh? Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I was just talking. I'm gonna have to stop. What I'll do, I'll make y'all a copy of something like this, and I'll try to draw it out on paper, and give you the corresponding chapters, and show you. I'll sit down and figure this out, and come up with a way to show you how it works. That way you can see. It's important not just to open up one of the Gospels and say, it's what it says over in Matthew. That's good enough for me. And you're going to miss what Mark said or what Luke said. I I've been doing more talking this morning. This is I am a teacher, but this is more just straight talk teaching this morning, so you can see some things. Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer. We'll come back. We go to predestination for this Wednesday night. We're back on the 70 weeks of Daniel tonight. We're coupling Revelation and Daniel together. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your truth. Lord, help me to unravel this scripture that you've given us. You're such a magnificent God. You've let us see things. God, I'm here to do your will and your work. I'm willing to die for this message. But Lord, I pray you'll keep me here for some years for the church. I feel like they need me now. You've matured me over the years to bring me to this place. I want to help the flock. I want to help them to grow up and mature. God, will continue to praise you for everything and glorify you. We'll live for you if you give us strength, Lord, and courage. And by your grace, Lord, we'll stand in truth. Lord, those that are weak here among the flock, give them strength to grow, more patience and compassion with one another. That's hard to have sometime when we're our sin living in ourselves. And we all do that, Lord. Cause us all to overcome. You've helped me through the years to grow. Help these young baby sheep to mature. We'll continue to praise you and glorify you in all things. In Christ's name, amen.